welcome to Head First with Dr. Hill. This is our video podcast with a weekly release schedule, and one of our first guests is Ben Greenfield, fitness professional and biohacker extraordinaire. So Ben and I have been talking for weeks trying to get him down to Los Angeles to do a quantitative EEG, a brain map, and here he is in studio. And so we'll do that a little bit later on in the hour. But first, Ben, why don't you introduce yourself and tell our listeners who don't already know who you are, who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. I have been trying for weeks and weeks and weeks to get to LA, avoiding the traffic, and finally made it down.
It's tough.
Yeah. So happy to be here. And I mean, I've been in the fitness industry for the past couple of decades. Pretty much started off in personal training and then began to delve into nutrition, biohacking, performance of not just the human body, but the brain, digestion, hormones, sleep, fat loss. And what I do now, after being a personal trainer for about a decade, is I now speak and I write and basically do the one-to-many thing in the fitness realm. But I'm pretty much obsessed with helping people get better bodies and, in this case, brains.
Great.
So,
that's wonderful. Yeah, Ben and I actually, we spoke at the same event, but we sort of had shifts
the Seal Fit event.
Yeah, we were just offset in time, so I didn't get to see it.
I think we were probably the least muscle-bound guys there.
We totally were.
Far.
Yeah, I certainly was.
There
I
were
felt
some
tiny.
big brutes running around
Absolutely.
there. Yeah.
Well, great. So, I have lots of questions for you about all the things you do to keep yourself healthy, as well as your perspective on some of these, biohacking strategies for both body and brain health. But we're going to start off the hour by gathering some brain data from Ben Greenfield. So we're going to take a peek under the covers and look at your gray matter. Actually, we're not going to look at your brain itself. We're going to look at the electrical activity that your brain is producing. So as I'm sure you know, Ben, we do something called Quantitative EEG at Peak Brain. And that means a brain map or an assessment of resting baseline brain activity. And for any viewers who don't know, a quantitative EEG is essentially it's not really a diagnostic tool. The joke I tell is it's a prognostic tool. We get a sense of what might be true about one person's brain. And this is a database compared analysis, meaning that it's not an arbitrary clinical judgment. I don't just look at your brain activity and say, oh, you have this kind of brain. But instead, I take your brain activity and compare it to a normative database of several thousand people who all are medication-free and caffeine-free. And by the way...
I'm keeping my fingers crossed all these thousands of people aren't extreme geniuses or I'm going to look really bad.
They are a normal variable population.
All right,
so you'll fall somewhere in there, I assume. And thank you for abstaining from caffeine today. One of the caveats of QEEG.
Yeah, I hate you now.
Yeah, exactly. It's for folks who don't know, it's about 2 in the afternoon, and Ben is caffeine free, so he can have this quantitative EEG brain map done today. So that was a sacrifice on his part.
I have a date with Starbucks within about an hour and a half,
Nice.
just so you know.
There you go. Great. So we're going to start putting a dry cap. I've recently switched in my clinic to using pure dry headsets when possible for quantitative EEG. So we won't get your great hair messed up too much. But I'm going to have my technician, Sean, who's in the background here, stand up, and we're going to start putting a brain map cap on, QEEG cap on. This is a wearable sensing dry cap, a DSI 24, for anyone that's curious. And as you can see, Sean's starting to work all these little tiny electrode heads down through Ben's hair. So normally when you do an EEG of any sort, quantitative or clinical, you need to sort of exfoliate little spots of scalp and spend about 10, 20, 30 minutes sticking a couple dozen wires to people's heads.
I exfoliate like that daily in
Do
the
you?
shower for
Really?
20 to 30 minutes, so we're good.
Nice. You have really soft scalp.
Yeah, exactly.
That's great. And so what Sean's going to do, he's putting some ear clips on right now. This will pick up Ben's, the electrical activity, believe it or not, in your ears. Ears are not electrically neutral. They do have a signal. And we actually measure each spot on the head relative to either other spots or to the ears. And so after we have this data all gathered, we'll have sort of 2 formats of data, one of which is looking at every spot in your head compared to the earlobes, sort of a distant reference. And the other way we look at the data is every spot on the head compared to surrounding spots. And this gives us sort of a local emphasis on that data. It'll take
It's actually quite comfortable.
It's not too bad.
I could get used to this. Can I wear this home?
Maybe not that particular device.
The $25,000 headset walking through the airport?
They are a little pricey, and you might get some weird looks in the airport and get sort of selected for a random search if you walk around with that thing on your head, I would guess. Either that or they might check you into a hospital.
It works for some of the X-Men.
There you go. Well, if you start developing strange powers, then I know I'm onto something.
Yeah.
So nice. Well, so as Sean's doing this, it's going to take us some time to adjust each individual electrode head. So he's spinning them down. There's little metal pins under each electrode, and Sean is sort of spinning them down through Ben's hair and working the skin a little bit to have it sort of release a little bit of sebaceous secretions or sweat and oil. And that actually is what the cap uses to make the connection.
I don't sweat, I glow.
You glow. That's right. A healthy young glow. So it'll take a few minutes to get all the electrodes set up and make sure we have good signals, and we may have to have you, sort of relax your muscles if there's some muscle tension.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel as though immediately when the device is placed on my head, I adopt an upright posture.
That's good.
I think it's the awareness that there's a very expensive thing on my head right now.
That's right. It's not that heavy though, right? It's not super uncomfortable.
It's like a baseball cap.
Yeah, when we use wet caps, they're actually a lot more annoying. They're sort of this swim cap, Lycra-based swim cap with holes in it, and we have to squirt gel through about 21 holes in the cap, which ends up with a full head of electrode gel. So for adults with average or not too big or too small kinds of heads, I use this system. Yeah, there you go. But as Sean's getting set up, let's start hearing more about your perspective on some of these biohacking things. So I know you're a health and wellness professional. As you introduced earlier, you have a long history doing these things. I actually don't know all the details, in spite of having been on your show once or twice and having talked to you a bunch. I don't really know your full perspective on these things. So I'm curious, first of all, about diet. I'm a hardcore, sort of paleo primal diet guy. My linchpin in Peak Brain, Derek, is a hardcore plant-based guy, and we get along regardless of that, actually, which is kind of nice. Yeah. But I'm curious where you fall on the sort of high fat, low carb versus low carb, high plant. Where are you at in that?
That's kind of funny. My podcast sidekick on my show is Australian female vegetarian. Okay. And I am a red-blooded male meat-eating hunter. Nice. So I understand the tension.
That's right.
But my perspective and the reason that I haven't written a book that has the word diet on it is that there is no one perfect diet. There are people who, based on their genetics, actually do quite well, in this case based on methylation, with a primarily plant-based diet versus a meat-based diet. And there are people who do better on macros that consist of higher amounts of fat versus higher amounts of carbohydrate. So what I like to do is start off with looking at genetic individuality, along with, and this is the part that I think some people ignore, what that person is doing from a performance standpoint, right? Because you can take someone and put them on, let's say we were to argue that like a ketotic diet were ancestrally appropriate for that person, right? Like say eating 30 to 50 grams of carbohydrate per day. And that diet may work for something like, let's say, managing epilepsy and seizures or managing, MS or something of that nature. But, then you take an Ironman triathlete or a Spartan racer or a bodybuilder or a CrossFitter, and they try that same diet. And even though in the absence of their what we could probably say would be unnatural physical goals, that would be a healthy diet. In the case of what they're actually pursuing, it becomes a diet that restricts necessary energy levels.
Of just output of calories, output of energy?
Glucose deprivation leading to hypothyroidism because you get inhibition of T4 to T3, hypercortisolism as cortisol surges up to mobilize glycogen from the liver, testosterone defects as the HPA axis gets downregulated from inadequate calories or inadequate carbohydrate. And so, you can't just look at what's genetically appropriate. You have to look at what is appropriate from an activity standpoint.
Do you think you can sort of ramp up the fat-burning metabolism to such an extent that very low-carb diets can be maintained, even with a high level of athletic output?
You can. I was talking with a guy about this in the sauna this morning. He's preparing for this big paddleboarding race down in Kauai. And he said, well, is it going to help me to do a high-fat diet leading up to this race? And I said, well, it can. Yeah, like if you're burning a higher amount of fats as a fuel, if you are efficiently producing and utilizing ketones, the byproduct of fat metabolism, and you have the mitochondrial density necessary to produce lots of ATP from fat, then absolutely. That is a really good, we could say like a nutritional biohack for, let's say, like a long endurance event like that. The problem, and this is what the discussion led to in the sauna this morning, he said, well, great, I'm in. my race is in 4 weeks. I'm going to start doing the coconut oil and the MCT oil, and avocados and, fattier cuts of fish and seeds and macadamia nuts. And the problem is that it takes 1 to 2 years to get the mitochondrial density and the adaptation to a fat-based diet to where it actually becomes a decent performance hack.
And is that a diet-based adaptation over 2 years? Or
That's a diet-based adaptation. There was a study at University of Connecticut, and I was one of the subjects in this study where they took one group of athletes and had them follow a very high 85% plus fat-based ketogenic diet for 12 months. And then they had another group follow a normal, whatever the Gatorade Sports Science Institute is currently recommending. 50 to 60% carbs, 20 to 30% protein, 10 to 30% fat. And what they did, and they've never done a study, this is the important part, they've never done a study of that length, comparing a fat-based to a carbohydrate-based diet. Most of the studies are 4 to 12 weeks in length.
Sure.
What they looked at in that study, in addition to things like gut microbiome, the muscle's ability to store glycogen, which is very painful, by the way. They stick a needle into the tissue and do a biopsy and take actual chunks of muscle out and see if you're still able to store carbs in muscle.
Wow.
The biggest part of the study, though, was a 3-hour run on a treadmill, the fat group and the carbohydrate group. What they found was that after 12 months of following a high-fat ketogenic diet without too many cheats, without too many errors made walking past an Italian restaurant, they found that the athletes following the high-fat diet were burning, on average, 1.7 grams of fat per minute. And what exercise physiology textbooks will tell you is that the maximum amount of fat per minute the human body can oxidize is 1.0 grams of fat per minute. So in essence, this study rewrote the textbooks when it comes to how much fat the human body can actually oxidize. Again, with what got us started down this path, the caveat that you have to be following that diet for a pretty extended period of time. And I would not necessarily argue that a diet that high in fat is socially achievable in many situations.
Okay.
It's tough to follow, and I think you can get pretty good benefits from eating a higher amount of fat. Again, if that's something ancestrally appropriate for you. Let's say you're not sub-Saharan African or perhaps Southeast Asian, or you come from a genetic heritage that might dictate not eating that much fat. But if you're actually eating that amount of fat, you could get away with close to like 50 to 60% rather than like the 80 to 90%. And I personally, that's what I do now. Like I eat about 50 to 60% fat. I follow what would be called cyclic ketosis, right? Where I stay high fat most of the day. I do lots of intermittent fasting. I don't snack. I don't graze. And at the end of the day, I do a hard workout, which upregulates the GLUT4 transporters responsible for taking sugar and shoving it into muscle tissue. So the pancreas doesn't have to release as much insulin. So sugar doesn't hang around in the blood for as long a period of time. And that's when I will eat a higher amount of carbohydrate with the meal.
And so you're essentially going into a higher carb state than at night.
Very briefly. And I've done blood testing, postprandial blood glucose testing, and also ketone testing, breath ketone monitoring and blood ketone monitoring. And I found it takes about 2 to 3 hours, after a post-workout meal comprised of, a little red wine beforehand, sweet potatoes, yams, white rice, quinoa, amaranth, millet, sourdough bread, whatever it is that I'm eating, not cherry tarts and pizza. I choose real foods, but it's pretty amazing how quickly the blood sugar returns to normal when you use that strategy.
And do you think eating your carbs at night is helping the sort of growth hormone release that tends to happen when we sleep? Are you priming that in some way?
There's a couple of studies that show that insulin sensitivity may peak at night based on your natural circadian rhythm. But for me, the logic goes like this: your grip strength, your reaction time, your body temperature, your post-workout protein synthesis, and all sorts of other things peak between about 4 and 7 p.m. during the day, based on your natural circadian rhythm. Because of this, I choose that time of day to do my hardest workout.
Gotcha.
The type of workout that would upregulate those GLUT4 transporters and make me more sugar sensitive.
Sure.
If I were doing a workout like that in the morning, I would consider flipping the scenario and doing like a high carb breakfast, a lower carb dinner. There's a gentleman I spoke with named John Kiefer, who popularized a diet called the carb backloading diet. He argues that no matter when you do your hard workout, you're still going to be most insulin sensitive in the evening, and that you're going to get the most anabolic effect and the least, say, fat gain effect from eating your carbohydrates in the evening. but I'm not sure I've seen quite enough evidence to say that I, for sure, if I were doing like a hard workout in the morning, wouldn't just shift my carb intake into the morning.
Sure. Well, the human body has a maximum ability to absorb carbohydrates as muscle glycogen at about, 50 grams per hour max, right? So anything more than that anyways is going to be sort of defeating the equation.
Right.
I'm guessing you aren't doing more than 50.
Yeah, and then the other thing that's important is for people who are concerned about, am I going to have enough glycogen or enough energy for the next day's workout if I miss that 2-hour post-workout window after my morning workout? What they've shown is that glycogen, liver and muscle glycogen levels will return to normal if you just eat according to appetite within about 8 hours.
Okay.
And so unless you're doing like a 2-a-day workout, let's say you're working out at 6 a.m. and then again at noon, and that post 6 a.m. workout would be the workout after which you'd really actually want to prioritize that that magical post-workout feeding window.
Sure.
But in many cases, you actually get a little bit more of a growth hormone response by avoiding a heavy feeding post-workout and instead just basically waiting until your next meal, or at least not walking out of the gym and stopping on your way out for the 20-ounce Jamba Juice.
Right, or the In-N-Out burger.
Right.
So
right.
Okay, great. So I think we have the EEG cap on, getting some good signals. Did we, Sean? Are we all good?
Got a little drift.
Okay. That's mostly
Rate, but
great.
There's
all
been
right,
no shouts to take me to the hospital yet.
That's
so,
right. That's right.
So
And
now I'm
Sean hasn't
confident.
exactly. There's been no shock on Sean's face. He set you up. So, all right. So we're going to take a break on the camera for just a second. We need to have Ben do 2 baseline recordings. So we're going to do about 3 to 5 minutes of eyes closed and 3 to 5 minutes of eyes open recordings, and that's the data we'll analyze for your map. So we'll take a break now for the camera, and we'll be back in a moment. Okay, so we found some brain activity. Ben is alive and has some evidence of cognition going on up there. That's pretty awesome. So Sean's going to take this cap off, and unlike the wet caps, these things come right off and leave you without any evidence of having been assessed.
Very pleased to have not been found to be a vegetable.
That's right.
I was a little concerned.
You definitely give a good imitation of somebody who's cognitively intact, so...
Yeah, no, I'm a good poser.
There you go.
Yeah.
And you can't see yourself, Ben, but you have these little tiny dotted circles now all over your skin from the...
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, those will go in a few minutes.
I'll have to Snapchat that.
There you go. Great. So Sean's going to process some data for us. We can talk about what we found in a few minutes. But while he's doing that, I'm still interested in your own perspective as a biohacker. What do you think about sleep? I know you're a big fan of controlling sleep, so to speak.
Yeah, I definitely have thoughts on sleep. By the way, we were talking about nutrition before sleep, and I have to mention the fact that I don't just think you look at genetics and macros. I'm a huge fan of blood testing, salivary testing, gut testing, urine testing to identify specific parameters that you need to address. So I'm a huge fan of dietary customization.
Beyond things like methylation, what sort of things come out of that kind of data? Like what,
you could
what are you
look
looking
at
at?
bacterial balance in the gut, presence of or absence of inflammation, something as simple as blood vitamin D status, cortisol, testosterone, free testosterone, sex hormone binding globulin, all sorts of things that could be affected by either lifestyle or by diet. So, there's a pretty extensive list of things that you can look at, but ultimately, I hate to see people, more or less wasting their money on supplements that someone told them they should take, or a diet they've been told is perfect for their genetics, when there may be other things that actually do need to be addressed that you find out from blood, just a basic blood panel, or a dried urinary panel for hormones, or a 3-day gut panel for stool, or anything else that in our day and age is not that hard to come by compared to how hard it was for the average person to get that stuff like 10 years ago.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So sleep. What are my thoughts on
first of all,
sleep? I like it.
How do you sleep? I mean, what is your sleep routine like?
I'm a sleep princess. So I diffuse lavender essential oil, and I'll typically use cannabidiol, a little bit of microdosing with melatonin, a little bit of 5-HTP, sometimes some holy basil before sleep. And the reason for the lavender and the holy basil is I have done that dried urine test and shown that I produce lots of DHEA and good amounts of testosterone, but also good amounts of cortisol. And so I've found that helps me, being a high cortisol. I don't have adrenal fatigue. I don't have issues with cortisol deprivation. For me, it's more cortisol excesses. So I'll do that before bed. I typically dial down the room temperature to somewhere between 62 and 65 degrees.
Great, great.
I'm fortunate in that my wife likes that temperature too. Otherwise, I'd get one of these fancy chili pads that people are sleeping on now to cool their body as they sleep without bothering their partner. Blackout curtains in the bedroom, along with a sleep mask. And the sleep mask is more often than not something I rely on when I'm at a hotel.
Okay.
When I walk into a hotel room, I unplug the television. If the router is in the hotel room, I unplug that. I unplug anything that produces light, the alarm clock. And I don't know if you've talked about this on your show before, but you don't just have photoreceptors in your eyes; they're on your skin, and so you want to make sure that the room is as black as possible. I have roosters, chickens, goats, children, so I sleep with binaural beats and white noise. So I use a phone app. Right now I use one called Sleep Stream, and I keep my phone in airplane mode. To keep it charged, I plug it into a portable battery rather than the wall, just so you get a little less dirty electricity from your phone as you're laying there at night. And so I play the binaural beats, wear the sleep mask, diffuse the lavender, keep things nice and cool. And those are some of the biggies. And of course, there are the things that everybody knows. I don't have to insult people's intelligence these days by talking about, avoiding screens and keeping the bedroom for just sleep and sex and basic things like that. But yeah, I highly value sleep. And when I'm traveling, I start my sleep routine in the morning, meaning that I go out of my way, if there is sun, to expose myself to large amounts of blue light in the morning to jumpstart the circadian rhythm. And if it's gray, or if I'm indoors at a conference, I will either use in-ear light therapy, a couple of buds that will produce light in your ear. It just looks like you're wearing headphones. I use something called a human charger for that, and this is in the morning. Or there's a set of glasses that produces a greenish blue wavelength, which is actually healthier and less damaging to the retina than these light boxes that a lot of people put on their desks, and that one's called Retimer. So I'll do either lots of sun is my preference because that's the most natural. But if I'm at a conference or something like that, I'll do the in-ear or the eye phototherapy to ensure that I'm not getting a circadian rhythm that's shifted too far backwards or too far forwards. So you combine light presence in the morning with light absence in the evening, silence, darkness, cool, and any relaxing supplements. And that's how I sleep.
So those sorts of things will, to some extent, make up for variable entrainment. If you're not sleeping enough or you're running on a crazy schedule, those things will sort of shore up the desire of your brain to slide its photoperiod entrainment past the Earth's.
They do.
But how regular? Are you sort of a 6-hour sleep night regardless, or is it variable?
I'll generally, when I'm in a competition phase, because it's going to vary. There are professional athletes that and they've done studies on this. They hit more free throws, or they're more accurate with their tennis serve with 9 to 10 hours of sleep a night. But we're talking about a professional athlete, right? We're talking like 5 to 6 hours of training per day, plus a great deal of mental stress, mental load. I personally shoot for approximately 35 sleep cycles a week. Okay. So if you can get 5 sleep cycles for a 24-hour period, and a sleep cycle is going to be 60 to 90 minutes long. I use a ring called an Aura ring to track my sleep cycles, and any ring isn't going to, or any quantification device isn't going to be as accurate as a sleep lab. But I shoot for about 35 sleep cycles a week, which means if I'm getting 3 or 4 sleep cycles because I'm at a conference or something like that during the week, on the weekend I'll shoot for a couple of nights of 6 sleep cycles and be in bed for 9 hours.
9 hours,
But by the end of the week, you should try to rack up right around 35 sleep cycles.
Now, how does this work with you have a wife. How does your sleep and your partner's sleep affect each other? Is she letting you sleep when you need to? Or?
We have a good relationship, which means that if we are in bed at the same time at night, good things will often happen and ensue. And so we generally, the kids usually go to bed, 8:30 or 9. We're in bed by like 9:30 or 10.
Okay.
And having been in LA the past few days, spending time with people who go to bed at 1 or 2 a.m., it's always a shock to my cycle when I step outside of my tiny home in the forest and realize that not everybody acts like an old fuddy-duddy like me.
Right.
But I go to bed, just based on the natural circadian rhythm, and even that, if you've been camping or hunting, the body starts to get tired about 8:30 in the complete absence of artificial light, and so when I'm in those settings, I'm an 8:30 p.m. to 4:30 a.m. type of guy.
Now, when you're in those sorts of settings, do you ever experience the sort of middle period where you sleep for a few hours, wake up, and have sort of a reverie, and then go back to sleep again?
Absolutely. That's on the more relaxed. Like if I'm hunting, I do bow hunting, spot and stalk, and so I'm hard all out during the day, and typically sleep like a baby at night. I don't have that wake cycle. But if it's more of like a wild edible foraging or a little bit of hiking, something like that, and then I'm sleeping at night, yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. So that's sort of a potentially prehistoric, if you will, natural way of sleeping without the light cues to push your onset back.
Right, exactly. And granted, you do have some light cues from the stars and the moon, and that's certainly something our ancestors would have experienced. But bear in mind that light that you're experiencing in that situation is paired with the absence of artificial light, assuming you're not on your cell phone all day in the woods,
right, sure.
When you're in more of a wilderness setting. And so I would hazard a guess based on zero research that I've seen that in the absence of artificial light, the potential of non-blue light at night is probably less sleep disruptive if you haven't been staring at screens all day during the day. Makes good sense.
Absolutely. Great. So, all right, let's see. What other questions do I have for you here? Exercise. I mean, we're both, of course, biohackers. I'm more on the brain side. You're sort of in the brain and body side, but certainly you have a long history as a physical trainer, right? So, what is your own personal, workout routine when you're not in competition mode? When you're not trying to reach some special, goal. Right. What is the maintenance? What is the keep Ben healthy routine?
Right. I competed as an Ironman triathlete for a decade, and I was fast. I didn't race pro. I raced as an amateur, and I was consistently one of the top amateurs. I went and raced Hawaii Ironman World Championships every year, and the reason I'm putting this in context is because I trained about 8 to 10 hours a week. For that.
That's not huge amount.
My peers were training for 25 to 40 hours a week. But the kicker here is that I tweaked my environment and still do tweak my environment to allow myself to be very physically active during the day. So we're talking pull-up bar in the door of the office, heavy punching bag hanging next to the desk, walking treadmill, a stool that I lean against, or a little special foot pad that activates all my tiny foot and core muscles while I'm standing. By the time the day has ended, I've taken 15,000 steps. I've done 50 pull-ups. I do 100 jumping jacks for every hour that I do spend inactive, which is relatively rare. But for example, when I'm traveling, I do 40 squats every time I use the restroom. So I have all these rules throughout the day.
Interesting.
So by the end of the day, I can do a very brief, high-intensity exercise session like we described when we were talking about priming those GLUT4 transporters, and that's like the cherry on top of the cupcake for fitness if you're competing. If you're not competing, if you're not an athlete, you can almost do what I've just described, right? Like lift heavy things a few times during the day, like a few pull-ups or hit the heavy bag or keep a heavy kettlebell next to your desk and pick that up a few times or do some swings with it. Walk, stay mildly physically active, and just avoid a sedentary position during the day, and you can stay very fit. And even as an athlete, if you pair that with brief spurts of heavier training or brief spurts of high intensity training, you would be surprised at how fast and how fit you can be without actually spending tons and tons of time in the trenches, which leads to the problems that people experience: injury, overtraining, hypocortisolism, all that jazz. And the final caveat to that is, of course, if you're going to do an Ironman or you're going to do a marathon, there will be every once in a while those sessions that you need to do that train you how to mentally go long, that train you how to use logistically whatever fuel source you're going to use when you're out there in your actual competition. But those type of sessions, we're talking like once every 2 to 4 weeks. Whereas there are people doing that type of stuff once or twice a week, the weekend long bike, weekend long run, weekend long swim, midweek long run. And that's where people are screwing up when it comes to training for ultimate endurance or ultimate fitness.
So barring sort of a professional level of athleticism, would you, is what I'm hearing, that you might just need to keep yourself more active and sort of engineer out the sedentary habits we have, and that would actually be enough to keep most non-professionals healthy?
It is a working man or woman's model of what is called the polarized training approach. They've looked at some of the most successful athletes on the face of the planet, some of the fittest athletes on the face of the planet: cross-country skiers, cyclists, marathoners, triathletes, you name it. They've found that all of them naturally adopt approximately 80% very light aerobic training. We're not talking about a lunchtime run where you're huffing and puffing, you're not working working too hard. You're not working super easy. We're talking about nice, easy conversational runs, long bike rides, walks in the forest, stuff like that. And then 20% is extremely high intense. We're talking maximum heart rate, things like Tabata protocols and 20-second extreme all-out sprints, things that activate a lot of motor neurons, things that build VO2 max, lactate tolerance, things like that. But there's very little time spent training in that dead zone, that gray zone that many people actually train in. So when I describe a scenario like I just described in terms of me operating at a low level of physical activity, as anyone listening can do, and then adding that 20% of high intensity, weight training or cardio or whatever it fits the bill for your chosen sport that you might be participating in. That's a scenario that actually simulates what a lot of professional athletes are doing, but just on a different level, that 80% to 20% approach.
Interesting. That's wonderful. So, all right, let's see. How are we doing on the QEEG processing? Almost done. All right, let's see. I have another question for you. So we done.
He hasn't shouted to take me to the hospital yet.
That's right. And I haven't seen any looks of shock or horror on his face either. So I think you're actually pretty intact. No seizures, no dead spots.
No missing parts.
That's right. That's right. As far as we can tell, we're only looking at functional activity, not structural. So there could still be missing parts. We wouldn't know, but we would see
nothing's fallen out during the course of my lifetime that I'm aware of.
That's pretty important, I think. Yeah, that's wonderful. So, aside from thinking about sleep when you wake up and planning your exercise, what is your daily routine like in terms of biohacking, keeping yourself fit? Do you have a massive medicine cabinet full of supplements and vitamins? Are you sourcing?
I would have a massive medicine, but I live on 10 acres out in the forest.
Okay.
And I'm a big fan of, if you are able to, relying upon what Mother Earth has right out there growing. So I can go pick wild nettles, and I can get plenty of vitamin C from dandelion leaf and plantain and dock and all sorts of things that are growing around me. And so I have that. I have a garden with a raised garden bed, goat milk, so I don't need to take colostrum and probiotics. And I've got chickens, so I don't have to do much in the vitamin A, D, E department. So I would say that, if that's not your scenario, certainly I endorse better living through science and having a medicine cabinet full of supplements that fill in the gaps that you might not be able to fill in with nutrition.
So obviously most people aren't, living on essentially farms. Let's say you're the, half the Americans who are living in cities and don't have a lot of access to, green spaces and growing food. What would you say are among the most critical, places to supplement or things to shore up?
Yeah. Well, to slightly return to what I said earlier, test if you can. I understand that testing can be expensive. If you simply cannot go out of your way to get a blood test or to figure out what you're personally deficient in, my top go-tos are, number one, a good fish oil.
Okay.
And I was at a friend's house yesterday morning, and he said, I'm taking a great fish oil. Check this out. And I took it, opened the lid, smelled it. It smelled like fish. I said, throw this out.
Yep.
Bad fish oil is worse for you than not taking fish oil at all.
Right.
And that's simply because a lot of people have omega-3 fatty acid deficiencies that fish oil can easily address. We do not live in a post-industrial area with perfect air, water, light, electricity.
Sure.
We are exposed to lots of radiation / inflammation / toxins / pollutants. So yeah, your ancestors might not have taken omega-3 fatty acids, but you need a little help in the inflammatory department, and this helps. So I'm a fan of fish oil, plenty of proven research behind it. I'm a fan of creatine. I'm a fan of about 5 grams of creatine as a nootropic to avoid sarcopenia or muscle loss with age. I like it for power and strength, of course, and I also like it because, like fish oil, it's heavily researched.
Yeah.
Shown to be safe, shown to be efficacious.
Do you know if I'm just curious, as an aside, I teach gerontology courses at UCLA, and we often harp on this idea of sarcopenia being a long, slow, almost irreversible decline, starts at age 30, and it's not only a loss in muscle mass, but it's an increase of lipid mass. So it's loss of bone mass.
Intramuscular fat, or?
Just general body-wide. You lose muscle mass, you lose skeletal mass and water mass, and you have an increase of lipid mass. And it does, over many, many years, become more abdominal, adipose gathering.
Visceral, intrahepatic.
Yeah, but I'm wondering if creatine affects skeletal, lipid, and water mass as well as muscle mass.
I do not know about that. The only thing I can comment to regarding that muscle structure as you age is a study that was done in guinea pigs. There's a great post on Paul Jaminet of the Perfect Health Diets blog about this, how they found that the type of muscle fiber that is best when it comes to anti-aging or decreasing the rate at which telomeres shorten is hard, wiry muscle, such as a power lifter might possess.
Okay.
And so, what I tell folks who are aging, who want to maintain muscle or maintain function or get the best anti-aging type of exercise protocol, is to include some type of explosive activity.
Okay.
Whereas if you read a book like Body by Science by Doug McGuff, a cardiologist, or I believe he's not a heart surgeon. I believe he's a cardiologist. He has a super slow training protocol for controlling peripheral and central blood pressure. Yeah. And so in a perfect scenario, I'm a huge fan of doing super slow heavy lifting, right? Like very, very slow controlled sets, 1 to 2 times a week, and then very explosive body weight or water-based type of activities for the other session.
In water.
In water. That's what I was doing this morning, was holding dumbbells at the bottom of the pool. You hold the breath, you jump out of the pool. But basically the idea here is that you want a combination of heavy stuff and explosive stuff if you are going to try to maintain muscle as you age.
Great advice. I think it's really a wonderful way to think about, tapping into your sort of body potential.
And then, not to stick my foot in my mouth, but if you don't test, the last one would be a multivitamin. So multivitamin, fish oil, creatine would be what
Great.
you take.
All right, so that's a good advice about the body. I think we're going to switch to talking about your brain.
And if people do want to know my daily routine that you asked about, I have copious blog posts on it at bengreenfieldfitness.com. So
Great.
I have written about it in gory detail.
Were we able to get this laptop on one of the screens? It is? Okay, there it is. Beautiful. All right, I don't know if you can see this, Ben. Probably not. Here.
I can see it now.
You can see it now.
Yeah.
Great. So what we're looking at are heads, essentially. These are
my heads.
Your heads, your brain activity. And if you look at these round circles, we're looking down from above. So your nose is up top, and then your ears on the sides. Actually, this is a touch
big
screen.
nose.
So
it's really sticking out there.
There you go. So as you go through these columns, they're delta through high beta. Very slow brain waves on the left, very fast brain waves on the right. We make all brain waves, all frequencies all the time. So that's not really a problem to have more or less of different ones. But we expect to see your brain do different things, eyes open and eyes closed. We expect to see different ratios of frequencies relative to sort of healthy or distractible states.
Right.
And when we see different patterns in these maps, we find them interesting but not definitive. This is a statistical analysis. This is you compared to several thousand people. And somewhat arbitrarily, we draw a line and say, okay, more than 1.5 standard deviations out of range, above or below, is probably clinically interesting, probably doing something that's causing some trouble or has some interest. These maps, these colored maps, go through dark blue, through dark red. The reds are hot, or excess, if you will, activity, excess power, higher than average. And the blue is colder, or less activity than average. Most of your maps look really pretty typical, really healthy, so to speak.
And when you say that, you would mean that most of them have a lot of green with little bits of red or little bits of blue.
So the green is, there's a little color bar here at the bottom. This is a bell curve. The green is essentially within half a standard deviation of average. So typical brains. I hate using the word normal because there really is not such a thing when it comes to brains, but typical or average. So most of these frequencies fall into the typical range in terms of the amount of electricity in a band we're finding at different spots on your scalp. There are a few things that are red here, and some of those red ones are actually some noise. You have a little bit of muscle tension in the back of your head, behind the ears, so some of that's a little bit noisy. And I'm going to switch to a different set of maps that often cleans up the noise a little bit. Let's see. Laplacien's open, right? Or is it not?
They are, yes. Should be in the back.
Let's see.
And that type of muscle tension can be created from something as simple as the head just being slightly forward or slightly back. And I know that as we were recording, it seemed like when I changed neck positions a couple times, some of that noise significantly decreased.
It did. So this is an eyes closed map that we're looking at right here. And you see there's a lot of red actually on this one. And so what this means is your brain is making 3 standard deviations above average in delta and in theta. And this is not the muscle tension. This is something specific to your brain. Also, there's something that shows up back here.
Delta and theta brainwaves.
Delta and theta brainwaves broadly in the back, a little bit of beta in the back here as well that's high. and a little bit of alpha that's a little tiny bit. So there's a few interesting patterns that could mean something. And I'm saying could because, again, QEEG is not a diagnostic process. It gives you a statistical arrow pointing in one direction saying, it's likely that things are unusual in this way.
Right. And the delta and the theta seem to me, just looking at it, it's like they're taking up most of the head.
They tend to, slow brain waves or big brain waves and tend to sort of distribute pretty broadly. And also your eyes are closed. Without visual input, the brain tends to go into a slow mode. And that's actually not an unusual thing.
Which is why you should wear a sleep mask when you sleep.
Exactly. Right? And in fact, we like to see differences between eyes open and eyes closed. So this is the eyes open equivalent.
Still a lot of red,
It's
though.
a lot of red. And so I often see delta and theta going down when you open your eyes. And yours didn't really go down. This would suggest that, especially with the delta being persistent with eyes open, that you may have had some concussions at some point in your life.
Yeah, I've had two.
So that's probably what we're seeing.
Why is that? Why would a concussion produce delta waves?
Great question. So delta, again, the slowest frequency. It's running between about half hertz or 1 cycle every 2 seconds up through about 4 cycles per second. That's really delta range. And delta is not a cognitive frequency. So you aren't thinking with delta. Delta, to some extent, is an autonomic frequency. So the brainstem runs in delta, if you will, and keeps your heart beating, your lungs moving. So it's somewhat of an automatic frequency. When you damage the cortex, you can sort of crush it or tear it away from surrounding areas of cortex. In both cases, it doesn't receive input from surrounding cortex. And if you have a bit of cortex that's intact, but not receiving input from friends, it does one of two things. It free runs with no inhibition, and that's a beta excess. That's a shearing damage, so the cortex was torn away from neighboring areas. Or a crush damage, the input signals, if you will, aren't being heard, and the cortex itself isn't sure what to do because it's been damaged. And it sort of defaults back to the brainstem frequency and just kind of goes back to the really core frequency the body uses to run the body, and which is a delta frequency. So delta is not pathological per se. In fact, you want to make a lot of delta when you're deeply asleep and not dreaming.
Yeah, you hear about that a lot. How like delta would be, or delta and theta would be very relaxing brainwaves.
Absolutely. And if you don't make delta when you're asleep, you aren't washing your brain, you aren't doing restorative stuff. Sleep consolidation or memory consolidation requires slow wave sleep or delta. So it's a really healthy phenomena when you're deeply asleep. It's okay to have when your eyes are closed. When you open your eyes, we expect sensory information to suppress a lot of the slow brain waves. It's not totally happening for you. This would suggest there's some scar tissue, some wear and tear in your brain, probably from all the athleticism you've been doing for the past 20, 30 years.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, in a situation like that, when you see, well, actually, let me ask you this first. Do you see this a lot in like fighters, people who have been knocked out a lot, people who have been concussed? Like, is this a common phenomenon?
It's common in people like that. It's also common in just the average person. Some high school kid who's done a little bit of football here and there or headed the ball in soccer too many times, and you see concussions. You see the evidence of some wear and tear damage. Again, not diagnostic, but it's a hint in that direction.
And so what do you do?
Well, we can break up these patterns with neurofeedback. Neurofeedback or biofeedback on brainwaves is one of the primary biohacking tools I use, both clinically and personally. And we would measure this delta moment to moment, and it's not stuck. It's not some flat amount. It's always fluctuating in response to other brain signals. And so every so often, it'll happen to go down. And in a biofeedback environment, you would be sitting there watching or having wires in the back of your head. And whenever the delta happened to trend in the right direction, something would happen on a screen. A spaceship flies faster, music swells in volume, and then delta goes back up and the game stops. And the next moment, delta goes down, and the game resumes. And this teaches your brain.
Are you thinking, okay, what did I just do to make that spaceship appear?
You're not actually. It's not a voluntary process. Your brain is changing so rapidly that the software, the feedback, is simply capturing the fluctuations your brain is already doing and giving you applause for fluctuations in the proper direction. You really have no voluntary control.
Completely passive. You just sit there and watch the screen.
It is. In fact, the process of neurofeedback was discovered on cats, right? And they're notoriously bad instruction followers. They don't really try to do very much. And it works on people who are nonverbal, people in coma. It's really a core low-level way the brain learns, parsing signals from the environment and trying to control or get information from those signals. So if you only give it a signal when it does certain things the right way, it does more of those things trying to get more signal, trying to get more stimulus from the environment. It doesn't know that the computer is not a real object. It thinks it's a tool it's trying to learn to use, for instance. So that's a little interesting. Probably is some wear and tear damage. When I see this sort of thing, I also do what's called the traumatic brain injury analysis. So up until now, all of these analyses have been compared to a normative population. But when I see some damage like this or some question of damage, I look at what's called a TBI, traumatic brain injury database. This is a different population. So this is the, on this thing here, you see there's a green curve. That's the typical population. The red curve is the TBI population. You are the dotted line. So even though there is some evidence of concussion, there's really no evidence of traumatic brain injury.
Over on the green curve.
You're dead center in the middle of typical population.
So are you saying that a concussion is different than a TBI?
Mild concussions might not show up as traumatic brain injuries.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I'm guessing you've had some wear and tear, some scar tissue, probably from concussion. If you weren't such a good sleeper, I might suggest sleep deprivation as influencing that data as well. But it looks to me like there's some wear and tear, but the concussion, or the actual traumatic brain injury, looking for closed head injuries, structural tract differences, those show no evidence of you having a TBI, traumatic brain injury. So I'm guessing you aren't going to experience much in the way of symptoms, and you probably don't have any sense of real, cognitive fatigue or concussive fog that is sort of persistent. So that's good. All right, so just a couple more interesting things about your brain here, Ben, that pop out. And again, just a caveat before I tell you all the things that are wrong with you, that this is just a suggestion about how your brain may work. So,
well, can you throw something positive in there, like this is something really good?
Well, let me give you something that could be good or bad depending on how you use it. So this is on the left an eyes closed map. And if you notice in the back of the head, there's a lot of beta. Now, beta is an active processing frequency. When your eyes are closed, we don't usually see a lot of beta in the back of the head because that's the visual cortex. When your eyes are closed, it's usually shut down. Yours is staying pretty lit up with your eyes closed, just in case. So we consider this a marker for vigilance.
Interesting.
And if it's getting in the way, it's hypervigilance.
That would be related to like the warrior versus warrior type of gene?
Absolutely. So this is could be actually both, but it's the sort of have your feelers up, staying really on, staying checked in. And if you notice, there's also a spot in the front middle that looks also a little bit red in the beta. And that's a part of the brain involved with switching your attention called the anterior cingulate. And sometimes when that is hot like this, it means you get stuck on things and your mind tends to cycle and spin a little bit. The two things together can be a problem. They can sort of be almost a ruminative worry state, or they can be somebody who's incredibly checked in. So like an OCD pattern can be pathological if it's getting in your way, or it can make you like the most powerful CEO on the planet. Right. If you're really detail-oriented and know exactly what you want to do.
Yeah.
So these things aren't necessarily good or bad, but it does suggest that there's a vigilance marker. Your brain is up and on.
Right.
Even when it might not need to be, even with your eyes closed.
Right.
So this might be why you even need like darker rooms to fall asleep, because a little bit of stimulus will grab your attention in a way it might not for the average person who isn't extra checked in.
I would have made a great scout back in the old days.
Exactly. It's essentially what this is saying. Yeah. All right, so let me close these amplitude maps for a second, and I'm going to pull up two more things. One is a marker of how fast your brain is, and one is a marker of the ratios of these frequencies. So the ratios, if you look on this page here, these are different frequencies that show us, this is a ratio showing us slow brainwaves over fast brainwaves, theta over beta. And the theta over beta essentially is a very well validated marker for executive function.
Okay.
The theta-beta ratio is among the most tightly applied sort of features for ADHD. If theta-beta ratio is high, you have ADHD. The FDA recently approved a diagnostic headset that mostly uses the theta-beta ratio to look at if you have ADHD or not.
Whole bunch of theta, not enough beta would be a high ratio. That'd be ADHD.
And if you're a young person, you have high theta-beta, it's an ADHD brain.
Okay.
If you're an old person with memory issues and you have theta-beta, the chance of progressing to Alzheimer's is dramatically higher than if you don't.
Got it.
So you can use theta-beta as a sign of executive function slipping or being a little bit sort of wide in general if you're ADHD when you're young. So your theta-beta ratios are fine. There's a little bit of yellow and red here, but it's for the most part we're looking at a green head overall.
I wouldn't be diagnosed as ADHD.
Not at all.
QEEG.
Not at all. And the alpha over beta might show up if you're inattentive or spacey. And if you look at that head, it's actually blue in the middle. So the part of your brain that's tending to stay focused on things, if you were what we used to call ADD, inattentive, that head would be orange or red, and yours is actually blue, so you're the opposite of inattentive.
So it's kind of like a combination of hypervigilance and attentiveness.
Exactly. That's sort of what we're seeing for you. And with that, I start thinking about, I wonder if there's some anxiety markers. And so one of the more robust anxiety markers is looking at the actual number of your alpha, how fast your brain is. So from across the table, I'm not sure you can see this, but your alpha is running at about 9.5 to 10 cycles per second. That is totally typical for the average adult human.
Okay.
10 hertz. That's a totally typical alpha. If your alpha was much slower than that, 9.5, 9, 8.5, you'd be very sluggish cognitively.
Right.
And if you're a little bit older, we might think that was a function of normal cognitive aging. But it's not slow, nor is it fast. With those vigilance markers we saw, if we also saw a very fast idle speed, essentially, in your brain, we would start to think those vigilance markers are hypervigilance or anxiety. Rumination.
Yeah.
But since your brain's just below 10 hertz on average in speed, I wouldn't necessarily consider those beta markers as hypervigilance, just being sensorially sort of checked in. Your feelers are up. Again, a warrior who tends to pay attention to the war. You'd be a good scout or hunter, if you will.
Got it. Be interesting to see what this did with a cup of coffee.
Well, what it would do, all those delta and theta excesses, those slow brain waves, those would be completely obscured. So I would not know, I would not have been able to say you had likely had some concussions if you'd come in with caffeine in your system. It would completely hide, suppress all of the delta and theta. And so this is among the reasons why it's so critical that I have you off of caffeine.
Right.
I mean, we might be having exacerbation of those features, that delta and theta excess, because it is, 2:30 in the afternoon or something. You might be in caffeine withdrawal a little bit.
Well, I usually nap at about 1:30 in the afternoon until 2:30.
So some of these markers might be enhanced
my body
by
is used to being asleep right
sleep
now.
dep or a little bit of caffeine withdrawal. This is why we have to be really cautious interpreting data in the context of the individual, not just the database.
Yeah, and activity, I would imagine, can affect it too. I had like 2-hour workout this morning in the pool.
Yeah. Potentially,
with hypoxia.
not as dramatically.
Okay.
Even stressors and mood, those things don't dramatically affect it. We're really looking at your traits versus your states, except extreme traits, sleep deprivation, anxiety attacks, massive caffeine, no caffeine. Those things do distort the data. But for the most part, this is a 10,000-foot view, and it's a suggestion of your traits, not how you are today.
Right.
So it looks like you've had some concussions, a little distractible, and you're a little hypervigilant. And so those are a little incongruent to happen at the same time. So we should assume that the delta and theta is more concussive and or some sleep dep.
Now you have Peak Brain here in LA, and I know
absolutely.
you're doing some clinics, around. I believe you're opening new clinics.
We are.
Right?
Yep.
What if I wanted to hack this? What if I wanted to fix this, but I did not want to come spend time in LA traffic?
Sure.
So
the closest clinic to you we're opening up is in Portland, Oregon. Not that far away, but still not super convenient for coming 3 times a week, right? So for folks that want to work with the Peak Brain way of training your brain, so our QEEG and neurofeedback approach, but can't spend 3 times a week in our offices, what I do is offer a supervised remote boot camp. And that requires somebody to come to one of my larger offices, which are currently in St. Louis and Los Angeles, to come to one of those offices for 3 to 6 days and have sort of an educational and assessment boot camp, where we spend a few days teaching you about neurofeedback, running the software and hardware, sticking wires to your head, charting your sessions, getting a sense of what to expect throughout the neurofeedback process, how it unfolds, what a bad signal looks like, what a good signal looks like. And we actually prepare sort of a training plan like a personal coach might. And we send you home with a pretty high-end laptop and EEG system, all sort of self-contained, a nice Pelican case. And we encourage you to train yourself 3 to 5 times a week. And I check in with you about once a week. And whenever you have tech problems or other difficulty, you check in. We're giving you protocols to try.
During those 3 to 6 days that you spend in LA, how many hours are you actually training?
You're in the office
ninja?
About 3 hours a week, about 3 hours a day, because you come in early in the morning.
So I could come here on a business trip, knock out 3 hours a day in your office, work on fixing this, head home with a case.
Absolutely. And then you're training yourself. And it doesn't work for everyone. You have to be somewhat computer savvy, not terrified of wires. But for most people, even parents working with their kids, this is a pretty effective way to do it.
It's one of the more fascinating brain hacks that I've seen.
Yeah, and we're currently working on some sort of apps to help manage all of the data from clients who are self-training and keeping a good dashboard about what they're actually doing day to day. A lot of the success of neurofeedback is predicated on what to do next.
So I can't fix this by playing Lumosity or Brainscape?
Unfortunately not. All of the cognitive training, quote unquote, Lumosity and those sorts of things, the research is roundly not supporting that they do anything. There is within game change, but you don't have what's called skill transfer. So learning to get good at a specific game on one of those platforms, even though your scores change, the exact same resource in a different context, no gains.
That's what I've heard. I've heard one good one is the NBAC training.
Yeah, the dual NBAC, about half the research suggests there's a positive effect, about half suggests there's no effect. So it's still a very weak endorsement in the literature, but it's the strongest endorsement there is for cognitive training.
Right.
So, and again, it's very low cost or free, getting a dual NBAC. There's several free downloads out there. It's not going to hurt you. Might be fun to do. You might as well try it. It's not going to do anything negative. but it's not really a big gun, so to speak.
Right.
I would encourage folks to look for like the real serious levers for adjusting performance. Of course, neurofeedback is very technical and hard to do and a little bit expensive, and so that's a goal to get to maybe. But the immediate things, sleep hacking, getting your fats under control, and meditation. Doing a meditation practice for even 15, 20 minutes a day appears to be enough to develop significant trajectory changes in executive function over even weeks. So that's an accessible thing.
One last question. What about, because I've messed around with transcendental meditation, and
Sure.
I work with music and learning and Sudoku and NBAC and things like
Great.
that. What about Kundalini yoga? That's something that I just started doing, and from what I understand, it can somehow assist with cerebral blood flow. Do you know much about that?
Well, I mean, all yoga to some extent can assist with blood flow. Most yoga has inversions.
Right.
You certainly, it's whole body exercise.
Yeah, it's lots of intense breathing and movement and closing your eyes
Absolutely.
and focusing like on the third eye.
And I think
chakra.
Kundalini has also an ecstatic component. So you're getting into the place of altered consciousness and pushing yourself to the point where your mind shifts. So there's other benefits there. But I'm a big fan, like you are, of moving slowly often, to sort of quote Mark Sisson. The idea is to get sedentary behavior out of your life.
Right.
And whatever you need to do, I think it's wonderful. I do a form of yoga called Ashtanga. So every morning, we actually have a studio right next to my office. That's kind of why I put my office there.
Nice.
And so, 6:30 in the morning till 8, doing Ashtanga, getting my blood flow going, and then next door doing neurofeedback.
Yeah, you asked about my morning routine, and it is infrared sauna, Kundalini yoga for 20 to 30 minutes, followed by a cold plunge.
So I think it's wonderful, broadly for your body as well as for your brain. I'm not sure that I have any strong feelings about Kundalini versus Ashtanga versus some form of Hatha versus any other form, Vini or Vinyasa yoga. I think if you're doing it, that's what matters. People always ask me, hey, what's the best kind of exercise for brain health? And my response is always the kind that you do.
Right.
Because people have a hard enough time committing to routines and daily exercise. That's the most important thing. So, okay, so we've covered your brain a little bit, and we've talked about your routines. Ben, thanks so much for coming on to Head First with Dr. Hill. We've had a great time talking to you.
Dude, this has been fascinating. I am incredibly intrigued by this whole process, and I think I'm going to take a deeper dive. And
there you go. Well, come on down when you have a check.
We can take out the red.
Absolutely. We'll get your kit all set up, and we'll get you some training.
Sweet.
People usually experience subjective effects within about a couple of weeks of training, and you usually got to train for a few months to make it permanent or long-lasting. All that being said, let's leave our viewers and listeners with opportunity to get to know you more. Where can they find you? Where can they look you up, ask you questions, and follow you on the great interwebs?
Honestly, just Google Ben Greenfield.
Okay.
You will find me, or you will find possibly a highly offensive website put up by some poser Ben Greenfield.
Oh, no.
But no, honestly, just Google me, and you'll come up with my website and my books and all that jazz.
Great.
So,
anything else you want to give us? Any plugs, any books you're working on, projects you have in the near future that you'd love to people to know about?
Well, I just republished the updated version of my book Beyond Training, which is about 500 pages worth of biohacks.
Oh, wonderful.
And lifestyle tactics, training tactics for gut, brain,
Oh, it's
hormones,
amazing.
sleep, you name it. So I just republished that with updated stuff because
I
it's
think I
very,
need a copy
very
of that.
fast at how quickly that stuff becomes unupdated.
Sure.
So that's at beyondtrainingbook.com.
Wonderful. Great. So thanks to Ben Greenfield, and for all our listeners and viewers, keep your brains healthy and safe, and come back next week for Head First with Dr. Hill.